Hi guys, welcome back to the Twits. Today we are going to be reading chapters 6 and 7. Chapter 6, The Frog. To pay her back for the glass eye in his beer, Mr. Twit decided he would put a frog in Mrs. Twit's bed. He caught a big one down by the pond and carried it back secretly in a box. That night, when Mrs. Twit was in the bathroom getting ready for bed, Mr. Twit slipped the frog between her sheets. Then he got into his own bed and waited for the fun to begin. Mrs. Twit came back and climbed into her bed and put out the light. She lay there in the dark, scratching her tummy. Her tummy was always itching. Dirty old hags like her always have itchy tummies. What was Mrs. Twit doing while Mr. Twit put the frog in her bed? She was busy doing something. So she was out of the room, and it gave Mr. Twit an opportunity to put the frog in her bed. What was Mrs. Twit doing? Pause the video now to write your answer. Then, all at once, she felt something cold and slimy crawling over her feet. She screamed. "What's the matter with you?" Mr. Twit said. "Help!" cried Mrs. Twit, bouncing about. "There's something in my bed." "I'll bet it's that giant skillywiggler I saw on the floor just now," Mr. Twit said. "The what?" screamed Mrs. Twit. "I tried to kill it, but it got away," Mr. Twit said. "It's got teeth like screwdrivers." "Help!" screamed Mrs. Twit. "Save me, it's all over my feet." "It'll bite your toes off," said Mr. Twit. Mrs. Twit fainted. Mr. Twit got out of bed and fetched a jug of cold water. He poured the water over Mrs. Twit's head to revive her. The frog crawled up from under the sheets to get near the water. It started jumping about on the pillow. Frogs love water. This one was having a good time. Is there really a giant skillywiggler in Mrs. Twit's bed? Pause the video now to write your answer. What does the word revive mean? So we're going to think about what's happening in the story. What just happened to Mrs. Twit? And then, so we think about what happened to Mrs. Twit. And then Mr. Twit got a jug of cold water and poured it over her. And then it says that he tried to revive her. So what do you think the word revive means? Pause the video now to write your answer. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. This is not a nice thing to happen to anyone in bed at night. She screamed again. "By golly, it is a giant skillywiggler," Mr. Twit said. "It'll bite off your nose." Mrs. Twit leapt out of bed and flew downstairs and spent the night on the sofa. The frog went to sleep on her pillow. When Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped onto her face. What do you think came to means? So it doesn't mean that she went somewhere, it doesn't mean that she arrived somewhere. So when Mrs. Twit came to, the frog had just jumped on her face. So again, think back to what had just happened to Mrs. Twit. Chapter 7. The Wormy Spaghetti. The next day, to pay Mr. Twit back for the frog trick, Mrs. Twit sneaked out into the garden and dug up some worms. She chose the big, long ones and put them in a tin and carried the tin back to the house under her apron. At 1 o'clock, she cooked spaghetti for lunch, and she mixed the worms in with the spaghetti, but only on her husband's plate. The worms didn't show because everything was covered with tomato sauce and sprinkled with cheese. "Hey, my spaghetti's moving!" cried Mr. Twit, poking around in it with his fork. Why couldn't Mr. Twit see the worms in his spaghetti? Pause the video now to write your answer. the new kind, Mrs. Twit said, taking a mouthful from her own plate, which of course had no worms. It's called squiggly spaghetti. It's delicious. Eat it up while it's nice and hot. Mr. Twit started eating, twisting the long tomato-covered strings around his fork and shoveling them into his mouth. Soon there was tomato sauce all over his hairy chin. It's not as good as the ordinary kind, he said, talking with his mouth full. It's too squishy. I find it very tasty, Mrs. Twit said. She was watching him from the other side of the table. It gave her great pleasure to watch him eating worms. I find it rather bitter, Mr. Twit said. It's got a distinctly bitter flavour. Buy the other kind next time. Mrs. Twit waited until Mr. Twit had eaten the whole plateful. Then she said, You want to know why our spaghetti was so squishy? What do worms taste like? So you need to go back and look for the bit where Mr. Twit is telling Mrs. Twit about how the spaghetti tastes. Sorry, pause the video now to write your answer. Mr. Twit wiped the tomato sauce from his beard with a corner of the tablecloth. Why? He said. And why it had a nasty, bitter taste? Why? He said. Because it was worms! Cried Mrs. Twit, clapping her hands and stamping her feet on the floor and rocking with horrible laughter. To be continued. Next week, we are going to be starting Chapter 8. Bye.